Well, and the one thing I would share, I think the point of the ACE study, one of the goals is to reframe the question, and it's not as what is wrong with that child, like somebody needs to help. What is wrong? It is what has happened to that child. So you're rephrasing the question instead of looking at that child and saying what's wrong with them. I need to get that behavior out of them. It's what happened to them. And how can we now start to get them to see that they're better than what they think they are?
Hi, and welcome to Miracles from the Hill podcast, where we share raw stories that display the anatomy of God's grace here at Miracle Hill Ministries. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe. And of course, you can like, comment, and leave a review. To connect with us, visit our website linked in the description box. And now, here is our host, Ryan Dirk.
Greetings, listeners, and welcome to the Miracles from the Hill podcast. We are embarking on this new journey today, our next season, which has to do with the experience of homelessness as it relates to children. And we are blessed to have Diane Turner here with us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Diane. For the listeners, if you're new, thanks for coming. If you've been here before, thanks for coming back. Please leave a comment. Please share with others, and we're going to jump in. Diane is a Miracle Hill employee. She's been a foster care coordinator here with us for a little over 3 years. She has a master's in crisis and trauma counseling, which means that she is specifically trained in trauma-informed care. And not only is she trained in it, but she is passionate about it. So again, good morning, Diane.
Good morning.
Excited to have you here. And we're going to jump in, and we're going to start, as we always do, with giving the listeners just a little bit more about who you are. So how did you get into social work and counseling?
Well, it's funny. If you'd have asked me when I was graduating college if this is where I'd be, I would have told you no. It was not even anywhere in the forefront of my mind. I was an education major and I got my undergraduate in kinesiology, which is just a fancy scientific word for I was going to teach PE for the rest of my life. So I never taught a day of PE. I actually taught 4 years of special education. So 2 years in middle school and 2 years in high school. I think I will tell you it takes a special breed to teach middle school, and I was not called to that ministry.
So your degree was specifically for middle school?
It was for high school. Well,
high school.
Secondary education. So middle school through high school.
Okay. So when we have our next Miracle Hill exercise class, you can teach it.
If I could remember half of what that was, sure. So I did, I taught, and then I was like, I don't know that teaching's necessarily for me. So I wanted to look into, and really honestly struggled in those formative years with just my identity and so I just bounced around from different things. So it was really not until I was an adult that I really formed, okay, this is where God wants me to be. And so about 15 years ago, I started volunteering as a guardian at Lytton.
Okay.
So if our listeners don't know what that is, kids that are brought into state custody and their families go to court, a guardian speaks for that child because children under the age of 18 are not allowed in family court unless they're there to testify. So a guardian comes in and speaks for them, what they want, and then also what's in their best interest. And so I volunteered doing that for about 5 years, and then went and got a job at the guardian office and did it full time.
So guardians are like neutral third parties that are the adult voice of the child in care.
Correct.
But part judge too, like you're determining what's best for the kid.
Right, because we're going to share, as a guardian, I'm going to share like what the child said they want, But what they want sometimes is not what's in their best interest, because 90% of the time they want to go home.
Sure.
No matter how bad the abuse was. And so we're going to share that, but we're also going to share, okay, Judge, this is what we think is in their best interest, because we're going to talk to all the parties involved, just like maybe DSS is.
Right.
But DSS's mandate is a little different. Their mandate is to reunify the family if they can find a way to do that. Where a guardian's mandate is what's in the best interest of the child.
So is guardianship like a state job?
It is.
Okay.
It is a state-funded job for every county in South Carolina but one, which is Richland County. And they are actually, the guardians in that county are part of National CASA, which CASA, I don't remember what it stands for now off the top of my head, but it's the nonprofit that runs the Guardian Ad Litem program in most states.
So how'd they get exempted? It's the capital.
I don't know. That's kind of funny to me that the only county that's not state funded is actually our capital county. Yeah. So I'm not sure.
Okay, so you go to work in the guardian's office.
Yes.
Work there for a season?
Over 4 years.
Okay.
And while there working in family court, if you ever want to see brokenness, just sit in the lobby of family court for a couple hours. It won't take long. You'll see the mix of all the biological family. You'll see attorneys, you see guardians, you see DSS caseworkers. They're kind of all mingled together. And the more I saw that, and then through the guardian office, they do training where they'll bring in, so I remember doing an ACE training, which we'll talk about in just a second. And that really started my mind and my passion on what is trauma and how that kind of affects how we interact with everybody, everyday public.
So how did the Lord use that to bring you here?
Wow. So I was working for a different nonprofit doing foster care, similar to what I do here, although I was doing the licensing piece as well. And so I really loved everything I'd heard about Miracle Hill. I've lived in South Carolina for about 15 years, and from the very beginning heard of Miracle Hill and knew and loved it. But I actually ran into Rich Sevilla, who used to work here. We knew each other when I was a guardian. He was a DSS caseworker, supervisor. And so one of the best supervisors. Shout out to Rich. Shout out to Rich. And I actually came to Miracle Hill and did a trauma training for their care coordinators and staff. And Rich was here, and I was able to kind of go, hey, do you have any openings here at Miracle Hill? And so it just started from there. So that our listeners,
thank you, Rich. So that our listeners understand. So when someone comes, when a person or a couple comes to pursue foster care with Miracle Hill, they have a myriad of different relationships along that journey. They'll have a licensing specialist whose job is to help people walk through the licensing process. Then once they get licensed and they get placements, they have a care coordinator, which is a person devoted to caring for them and the child while they're placed. Some foster care agencies, one person does everything.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So that's what I did at the other agency. If I got the family, I licensed them and stayed with them through care coordination.
The whole time.
Yes.
So you specialized in everything.
Right.
Okay. So you come to Miracle Hill, and you mentioned that before that you even had a training here on trauma. Why or how did the Lord develop in your heart a desire for a specialization around trauma?
When I started to look at my own history, I didn't realize that I had a traumatic childhood because I really have a horrible memory. Even to this day, I write everything down. And so when I started to really look back at my own family history, 0 to 6 years old, my parents were saved when I turned about 7, 8 years old. Prior to that, were unbelievers, very unstable childhood. And so as I was looking at my own childhood and where I struggled with identity, I realized, wait, This kind of coincides with a lot of what we're seeing with children who are coming into care with DSS. And it really just pushed me to learn more about myself. At the same time, how can I help other people? I was seeing, as I was working through the guardian office and trying to work with children, I didn't have the ability I needed to really help them. I was going in and listening, which is a huge part, but I didn't know what I was listening for. Like, what am I looking for? What am I trying to see so that when I do make a recommendation to the court, it's an informed recommendation, not just, well, they're sad. There's more to it than just they're sad.
Katie, you should write down somewhere that we need to do an episode on listening, right? Like, there is so much power in what you just said, how important listening is when we typically want to talk. But man, more importantly, understanding how to listen and what to listen for, especially when we're trying to help someone. That's powerful. So give us a general definition for trauma, maybe one that foster care would use.
Yeah. So, I'll give you the dictionary definition for trauma. So it's a deeply distressing or disturbing experience or a physical injury. So the interesting thing with the way foster care kind of may look at trauma is it can be anything. But typically in foster care, trauma revolves around the family unit as a whole. So what affects the child that's traumatic is those unstable family environments. But that can be anything from a parent that's not present and the child is left to fend for themselves, to those horrific things we think about of physical abuse or sexual abuse, those things.
Those are obvious.
Those are the obvious things.
Obvious
Correct.
traumas, and then there's a whole bunch that aren't obvious but can be just as damaging.
Right. And I think the key, one of the things we teach or train our foster families is what's traumatic to one child may not be traumatic to another. The same for us. When you think about a hurricane, some people, I remember I grew up in Florida, and in college visiting students that were there from like Nebraska, they're going to throw a hurricane party because they just think it's the coolest thing ever. Where growing up in Florida, I know the devastation of a hurricane. And when I heard a hurricane was coming, that was very stressful. And I would get very upset at students that wanted to have a hurricane party. Guys, go board up your window. Like, to me, that was not a party time. That was a get ready.
Or get out of Dodge.
Or get out, right.
Yeah.
So it's similar to with trauma, some things that you may have two children in the same home that are going to react completely different to the trauma they've experienced, even though they both experienced the exact same trauma. And some of that goes to temperament, which is a whole nother podcast that you might want to have. But they've both experienced trauma, and they both are probably going to need treatment for the traumatic experiences. It's just their reactions to that trauma are going to be very different.
Okay. So as I was looking through the questions, I was excited because I'm getting ready to ask you a question about diagnosing trauma.
Right.
And I actually know what this thing is, right? Like sometimes I do these episodes and I don't know, but we use ACEs in our adult programs.
Oh, yeah.
Right? To diagnose traumas from childhood. But anyways, so forget I said that, listeners. Let Diane answer it. So what are ways trauma is diagnosed in general? Are there specific tools that are used?
Yeah, so the ACE study is definitely a tool that is used, and that is adverse childhood experiences. And you can look at those experiences. So a lot of times the ACE study is used with adults, like you said. So it's not technically used with most of our children, although it can be used. But it helps explain why people may have the behaviors they have. If you look back.
The childhood traumas or the adverse childhood experiences can be predictors to behavior. Like statistically, they can be predictors towards addiction and crime and
Right.
what else can they predict?
It also can predict health issues
Okay.
because trauma affects our physical and our spiritual. It really affects the whole body. So it can be predictors. They've seen in the study of diabetes and heart problems and those type of issues as well.
So, not to get nerdy into the science, but like there's a difference between correlation and causation, right?
Right.
So, if somebody has an adverse childhood experience, a trauma, there is a clear correlation to diabetes,
Correct.
but that doesn't mean it's the cause.
Right. Absolutely. The correlation is that because of that traumatic experience, you may use food as a coping mechanism, which can lead to diabetes or heart conditions. But if you know that ahead of time, so that's the point of the ACE study, is when we know if your ACE number is high, you may have a predictor to maybe abuse food or abuse other substances to kind of cope with that trauma you experienced at an early age.
So for the young kids, and we're going to give some examples of what ACE is, but for the young kids, is it the therapist that is essentially scoring the score for the child?
Yes. So the therapist is going to talk to family members if they have access to that. They'll talk to foster parents, what do you know about this case? But typically through DSS, they're talking to the caseworker, what's the history behind this child's reason to be in therapy. And they're going to look at those ACE scores. ACE isn't used as much with children because typically there's other therapeutic models they're going to use to decide a diagnosis, like PTSD and some other things that children can be diagnosed with. But it is helpful to look at, if a child at 5 already has 5 traumatic experiences, then they know we really need to start now working with that child so that that doesn't affect them as an adult.
So PTSD, which everybody has heard of, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Correct.
So like in the context of this conversation, it really makes a lot of sense, right? Post-traumatic, meaning after a trauma, there is a disorder with how we deal with stress.
Correct.
Right? Because of the trauma.
Right.
Okay, so let's paint a picture with ACE. Like, what are some of the questions that are asked or discerned through that? Like, how are you diagnosing childhood trauma?
So I can tell you there are 5 personal questions. Okay. So there are questions that are asked, what happened to you specifically? Okay. So some of those questions could be, have you ever been hit? And so it's specific questions. Have you ever been hit? And they'll list all these different things. And you're just checking yes or no. Right. So it's just a yes or no kind of question. And then there are 5 questions that are related to your environment, your family. Anybody in your family abuse alcohol? Anybody in your family have mental health issues or attempt suicide? And so there's this long list of questions. And I remember the very first time I took an ACE survey. So if any of the listeners want to take an ACE survey, they can go on the CDC and look at the...
We'll link it in the show notes so they can just click on it.
Oh, great. And they can go ahead and take their own ACE survey just to see where they fall in that. And I remember the very first time I took an ACE study, I had a 1, which is very low. And then as I learned more about my family history and the things that happened from 0 to 6 that I didn't know and didn't remember, my ACE number went up, and it went up to 4, which makes a lot more sense. But I remember when I first took the ACE study, because I was in the Guardian program, there was one I thought was a yes, but I wasn't willing to say yes. Even though nobody was seeing the study but me,
You weren't willing
I
to
wasn't
acknowledge it.
willing to acknowledge that. So we have to get to a place where we can acknowledge
That's
that.
a counseling rabbit hole too.
Right. It is. It is. We could speak a long time on
Yeah.
that, but
Okay, so then these tools, as well as other therapeutic tools, are used to essentially diagnose whether or not a child or anybody really has a history that would kind of be fit underneath the heading of trauma.
right. Yes.
So this is not on the question, so I'm going to ask you a question offhand.
Okay.
So I think I was talking to Brenda in our podcast about this. Foster care can be a trauma in itself,
Absolutely.
right? Child's being pulled from their home, whether it's an unhealthy home or not, and placed with strangers
Right.
against their will. That creates a trauma. And so then it is the foster family and the child placing agencies charge to mitigate that trauma or lessen that trauma. So I say that to say, arguably, every child that comes into foster care has trauma that they're dealing with.
Yes. They have at least one.
They have at least one.
They have a 1 on their ACE scale right there.
Automatically.
Just from being removed from their home.
And which could mean undealt with, that it predicts these future behavior issues, right?
Right,
It's not
right.
that the kid is bad. It's that let me say that a different way. Oftentimes you see kids who come through foster care or group homes and you see poor outcomes long-term with them. And we think that's because in our minds that because the kid was some faulty with the kid.
Right.
When in the reality of it, it may be because there were these adverse childhood experiences and foster care itself that created traumas, and in many cases re-traumatized over and over and over again as they switched homes. And then we shouldn't be surprised that they have these negative outcomes if those
Right.
traumas aren't challenged or dealt with
Right.
or
Yeah.
healed, ultimately by the Lord.
Well, and the one thing I would share, I think the point of the ACE study, one of the goals is to reframe the question, and it's not as what is wrong with that child, like somebody needs to help. What is wrong? It is what has happened to that child. So you're rephrasing the question instead of looking at that child and saying what's wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
I need to get that behavior out of them. It's what happened to them. And how can we now start to get them to see that they're better than what they think they are?
So we are mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual beings.
Yes.
I feel like this is an obvious answer to this question, but we're going to unpack it a little bit. What does trauma affect?
That is it affects everything.
It affects everything.
It affects everything.
How does it affect those kind of different areas of who we are?
The biggest thing trauma does, and we could spend probably 10 podcasts talking about the brain and how trauma affects the brain. But one of the best analogies that I have ever heard that's great to work with kids with is to think of your brain as a hand. Mm-hmm. And so for our listeners, your forearm is your brainstem.
Okay.
And so your hand is your brain. And your thumb there's a word called the amygdala, and we're not going to go into the science of that. But when you experience trauma, it fires that amygdala. And your brain is this fascinating thing that, let's say you're driving down the road and a car pulls out in front of you. Your brain knows, okay, you need to survive this.
Threat.
Right.
Yep.
There's a threat. Hit the brake.
Yep.
You don't have to think about it. You don't have to process it. You just know to do that. For children, when that happens, they go into survival mode and they're going to do whatever. It's that fight, flight, or freeze, which I know
system.
y'all talked about in previous podcasts. And so your fingers on your hand are your prefrontal cortex.
The deep
which
thinking
is the reasoning.
Yep.
How we know. And the one thing that we've learned over the years, and I think this has been talked about a lot, is that doesn't fully develop. They say for women, 25-ish. For men, sorry, Ryan, in their 30s. It's
good thing I'm in my 40s. I'm good.
You're good. It's fully developed. But so think about those 4 fingers kind of encapsulating your thumb. You've put your thumb in the middle of your hand and you've covered your 4 fingers.
Mm-hmm.
When a traumatic event happens, it fires that amygdala, and it's almost like it just makes your prefrontal cortex
Stop working.
Yeah. So there's no protection.
Yeah.
When that happens over and over and over and over, your prefrontal cortex is not there to protect you anymore. Your brain gets stuck. And every experience you have, you feel like it's a traumatic experience. So children who their brain gets stuck in survival mode, even when they're placed in a foster home that's safe and loving, it doesn't feel safe and loving to them.
So so instead of getting into all the fancy brain terms,
right,
you've got this primal version of your brain, and it's your defense mechanisms. Right? Feed me, protect me, keep me safe. Then you've got this higher order part of your brain that helps you reason through life. And so what you're saying is traumas cause that primal brain to trump everything.
Everything.
It becomes the driver.
Right.
Versus the higher order thinking. And you just taught me something. So I've always heard that the brain development is like 25, 26 years. I haven't always heard that. That's relatively recent that they've started saying that within the past 10 years.
Yes.
So now you're saying that they differentiate between the sexes, and women are 25 or 26 and men can be into their 30s.
Yes. And that's probably in the last 6 to 7 years they've kind of said they've seen evidence that a man's brain does not develop that prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, that front part,
just
frontal
the
lobe,
front part, that reasoning,
the ability to make decisions.
To actually stop and think before you actually make a decision, which makes all the decisions college students make. We think, why did they think that was a good idea?
Because they don't know that and they think they're smart.
Right. And they didn't stop to reason through that. They just acted.
I was dumb as a bag of hammers until I was in my 30s, but I didn't know it.
Right.
Right. So I think this is super fascinating. So until our brain is naturally done developing, that prefrontal cortex, that frontal lobe, the area where we make decisions, is underdeveloped. When we're traumatized, that area is superseded by that primal brain. When we are in an addiction scenario, the area of the brain that's damaged is the prefrontal cortex. And if we are come from a trauma-based life, our brain may develop, but we have a disability on the mental and emotional side, a developmental delay.
Right.
All of which affects our decision-making ability, which means for all those scenarios, the primal brain's driving the bus.
Absolutely, yes.
Wow, that's not good.
No.
And
that does affect, so that trauma then affects our physical health, because a lot of times, again, we're not going to go into the science of this, but can trigger hormones to start earlier. And so we find that kids who've experienced extreme trauma may enter puberty early, have issues with obesity. And so there's physical effects.
Puberty early.
There have been, especially in girls, who will start their cycle way earlier into 9, 10, 11 years old because of extreme trauma.
It's like a survival mechanism?
They kick in those cortisol hormones. The brain starts to start those hormones to help survival. I mean, that would be a whole nother podcast. But and because those hormones are triggered so early, the body starts to really follow through with. So there's a great book, which we can link, called The Body Keeps the Score, by Bessel. I can't remember his whole name. It's hard to say.
In the show notes.
It'll be in the show notes. There you go. And it talks about how the things that happen in our brain affect our whole body. And so there's a lot of things that can be triggered early for children when they've experienced, especially chronic trauma. Not as much those short bursts of trauma, but chronic trauma that happens daily in their lives.
So,
especially if it's not interceded.
yeah. So, I want to ask about the spiritual in a minute, but I want to stick on this for a minute. So you have this mental developmental issue, you have these physical issues, and in many kids, those become linked, right? Yes. Like with like bedwetting, right, or other physical responses to mental disability. Why is that? Like, why do you see behaviors like? That's the only one that comes to my mind right now. Was it called urinesis?
Yes. So
and then there's also kids who won't. This is TMI listeners that won't poop.
Right.
Hold their poop.
Yes.
And that's a defense mechanism in some way. That's not a technical term.
No. Right.
I have small kids. I feel like I say that word a lot.
Well, and there are also girls who will gain weight on purpose, so they'll overeat because they don't want to make their body desirable to anybody if there was sexual abuse in their history, and that was their traumatic experience. So that's their survival mechanism. That's the thing they think. There's no reason to it, but they feel like that's going to help them survive in that moment. So for bedwetting, a lot of times they're afraid to get up to go to the bathroom. So sometimes you have to walk through what trauma happened.
They're afraid to get up to go.
And sometimes it's because they're afraid because there's trauma outside their bedroom that they don't want to go to. So even though they're in a safe and loving environment, their brain doesn't know that. And so in turn, they'll continue to wet the bed until they can start to work through where that emotion is coming from.
I feel like I just traumatized myself. I'm feeling really insecure about the fact that I said poop.
That's
so
okay.
I'm going to say bowel movement. Hold their bowel movement.
There you go.
Listeners, forget that I said what I said.
That's funny.
All right. Let's move on a little bit. So what are some common assumptions that people have about trauma?
So I think one of the biggest, especially with foster care, assumption is that if they choose as a foster parent to foster 0 to 2 years old, then they're going to get this beautiful little child in their home, and they've not experienced trauma. Or if they have, they don't remember it, so it's all okay. What they don't realize, one of the biggest, which we hadn't talked about yet, issues with trauma is it affects their attachment style. And so that's where trauma becomes the biggest issue, is that the way we relate to each other.
Ready to ask you to define it.
Right. The way we relate to each other, the way we attach to those around us is huge. I mean, you look at those that have addictive issues as adults, you can look back at, they have a skewed view of what a healthy relationship looks like. And so most children form, they say, in the first year of their life, their attachment style, what their attachment style is going to look like. So if they've experienced trauma in that first year of their life, they don't understand what a healthy relationship is.
So I knew a couple some years ago, and they adopted overseas. They adopted somebody from overseas. And they were telling my wife and I the story. And I'm not going to say what country it was, but they went over to another country, and they, had already picked out this beautiful little baby, and they are walking around this orphanage, and both of them didn't say it to each other, but something was off, and they could not figure out what it was. Like, something about this orphanage was wrong, and it took them until they got back in the hotel room that night to identify that it was quiet, because none of the babies were crying, because every baby in there had learned that nobody's coming.
Right.
And if you think that doesn't affect that child's attachments, right? Their ability to relate to another human being when their limbic system, their primal brain is saying, scream to get help.
Right.
And nobody comes.
Right. They'll eventually stop screaming to get help.
They stop screaming to get help.
Right.
They just accept their fate, even as an infant, which I think is fascinating and the saddest thing maybe I've ever heard.
Yeah.
A silent baby ward.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
something.
Well, and you have to think about during those first years, they're learning to self-soothe.
Mm-hmm.
But they learn to self-soothe first because a parent comes in and teaches that and models that for them because they feel safe to do that. They're learning independence, and if our kids don't learn that in those first couple of years of life, when a 5-year-old comes into foster care, we see they won't do anything on their own and everything's a battle for them. Something they should be able to do, like maybe sit on the floor and play, they can't do because they don't feel safe and comfortable to do anything on their own. So there's a lot of things that they miss out on in those first 0 to so many years. Even say a baby has a premature birth, but maybe because of drugs, and that baby immediately goes from the hospital to a foster home. That baby still experienced trauma, and that baby knows that. I mean, he feels that. They can't put words to it.
Right.
But they're going to probably cry all night. They may have sleep issues. They're not sleeping through the night. And, that foster family is going to feel that because they're getting lack of sleep, from that baby. So I think one of the misconceptions is that if we foster a younger child, we're going to catch them early enough. And there is some validity to that. I'm not going to say that there's not.
Right.
But I think the falsehood is that they've not experienced trauma and we're not going to see the effects from that.
So I'm going to butcher a fact and then you can correct it. It's something like 80% of our identity is formed in the first 5 years, or 80% of who we are is formed in the first 5 years. What am I trying to get at?
Yeah, so I think you're right. Our identity, I think, is a good word to put there. And so your brain does the most growth it's going to ever do from 0 to 5.
Look, that's a better thing. I'm going to say that from now on.
Okay.
It does the most it will ever do
in the life of your brain.
In the first 5 years.
In the first 5 years.
And if that's identified by even an instance of trauma, that affects the overall literal structure of your brain for the rest of your life.
For the rest of your life. It doesn't mean you can't overcome it, and it doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can do to support it. I think in the first season of the podcast, you had an episode on neuroplasticity, which is very fascinating. I loved that podcast, by the way. And there are techniques and things that you can do, but you're never going to completely change the brain back to what it could have been. You just learn to cope with where your brain is at the time.
Or rewire it.
And rewire it, right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So are there any other assumptions that people typically have? Or are there any assumptions that you had before you kind of got trained on trauma?
Yeah, I think my assumption was that, and I think a lot of people's assumption is that it doesn't happen to very many people. Trauma is this isolated thing that's going to happen if someone is a drug user or is an alcoholic. There's this small portion of society that is going to abuse a child. And unfortunately, again, if you go to family court, you're going to see that is a pervasive issue in our world today. Because trauma is so many different things. It's not just those who are in an addictive lifestyle. Trauma can be domestic violence. So it could be just neglect where, a deplorable home where there's not food. And sometimes that's because of financial or poverty. Sometimes that's just because parents are not providing the food. So I think for me, I had this misconception that it really wasn't a widespread issue. It was just... it just happens here and there. And that if people would just get help, it would all go away. that we could just turn it around tomorrow. Kind of that hero complex, if enough people stepped up and I think there's some truth to that we do need to step up and do our part. But it's such a widespread issue that, unfortunately, I don't feel like we do enough to help the family unit to overcome it. That it is a generational issue sometimes.
And if the whole is greater than the sum of its parts,
that's a great way to put that.
Then any trauma becomes part of who you are.
Right.
Unless God or really good counselors help you to deal with whatever that is.
Right.
Right? It's kind of like, I'm thinking about if we're a puzzle, it's like a completed puzzle where one of the puzzle pieces is the back of the puzzle, right? It's different than the rest of it. Throws off the whole thing, changes everything about the puzzle singularly, even though it might be one of 1,000 pieces.
Right. Absolutely.
Let's go back to the attachment thing just a little bit. So compare and contrast like an adult who grew up in a safe, secure environment with healthy attachments, and an adult who doesn't grow up with safe attachments.
Well, and so when we talk about attachments, I think the one thing I wanted to say, I don't know if I said this clear enough earlier, is it describes how our relationships shape our ability to relate to other people. And so one of the issues with trauma is it changes our focus, and our focus is on our reactions to the trauma instead of that attachment. And so I think one of the biggest things when asking that question, I think about after I've started getting some training in this, I was in the grocery store, walking down an aisle, and two adults screaming at each other. And I'm at one end. These two adults are in the middle, domestic dispute, or at least that's what it appeared to be. An older couple walking down the aisle stopped and actually engaged with this couple. It was like, man, it sounds like y'all have had a really stressful day. Is there anything we could do? That's the first time most people turn and run away.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first time I looked differently also, because normally I would be like, what's wrong with these people? Roll my eyes and just kind of judge them and walk away. And instead I was standing there, man, I wonder what happened, because the Lord had already started to reframe how I looked at people, with more empathy than with, kind of that judgment attitude. But it was a clear picture to me of two adults who had probably unstable, I don't know their history, but unstable at some point trauma in their life, and they were reacting to each other instead of responding to each other. And then this older couple who walked in, who engaged them in love, who didn't immediately react to the situation going on, but could respond to it, which told me that they, from just observing, probably had a stable, secure upbringing where they could actually engage this couple in a way that it was a relationship of love and wanting to help them, instead of this relationship of chaos and wanting to kind of battle with, you shouldn't be talking to her that way. And, they really did. And it was the first picture sign for me. It was like an aha moment, like a light bulb went off, and like, wow, I want to be like that older couple one day that can not judge this chaos, but actually respond to it.
Well, what I hear you saying is we don't know anybody's story.
Absolutely.
Right? So we make assumptions when somebody's life could be chaos, because that's what they were brought up in, was chaos.
Right.
Right? And so as a believer, the main thing that we need to do is see them as a human being, and engage them as having value, same as we do. It's what we teach all the time.
Right.
And hear their story.
Right.
right?
Right.
Like before we know the story, we can't make any assumptions about anything.
Right. Absolutely.
So that you're comparing these attachment scenarios where you're seeing chaos at some level, or isolation, or
Dysregulation,
yeah,
or, yes.
something, versus a healthy set of boundaries with other human beings where you're communicating by hearing and talking to the other person,
Right.
emotionally, mentally, all the different ways.
Yeah. So some of the things you might see in an adult who was brought up in a very traumatic childhood is you may see that they don't know how to communicate with other people outside of maybe anger or isolation. So they kind of go one way or the other. They just choose not to have a relationship with other people, or it's always high anxiety relationship with other people. You also have those addictive behaviors. Typically, you can see that in adults who have experienced, those high ACE scores. So there's a lot of behaviors you may see differently. We all have issues with communication.
Sure.
But someone who has had a traumatic childhood, that's going to be exaggerated, where they either aren't going to listen to you, they're always right. So there's always there are definitely things you can look at specifically. But none of us are perfect. We're all broken. And so without Christ, we don't we still really struggle with maybe communication on a relationship at a level. But as believers, if we're leaning on Christ and his word and meditation, then we can start to kind of reframe the way. One of the things we work with our foster parents is with children in their home is to respond to them, not react to them. And I think we see that as adults, that we need to be people who are responding to the things we see instead of reacting to the things we see.
Oh, man, I try that every day with my own kids and struggle.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I say all the time to people, to try to humanize the issue of homelessness, I say, remember that, that's somebody's daughter, or that's somebody's son, or that, that's somebody's child. But I think I'm now going to expand it based on this conversation to say that person you see was once a little kid, and we have no idea what their experience was. Right. That's a powerful way of framing
statement.
Things.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's flip back to foster care a little bit. And we've already talked about this a little bit. How can or will foster parents at times experience the effects of trauma in the children who are placed with them?
And it's an easy and hard question at the same time, because every child is different.
Sure.
And so if you were to ask a foster parent who's maybe had 6 placements, they would tell you every single one was different. But specifically, some of the issues they're going to get, and that we hear from foster parents, is just those behaviors. A lot of times, one of the things we try to train foster parents is, just because a child is in a safe, loving home doesn't mean they feel safe and loved. And so it's that felt safety that child isn't ready for just yet. And so some of the things they're going to see, there's typically a honeymoon period. Those first couple of weeks, it's new and exciting for some kids, not all. And so they're on their best behavior, because they want you to like them. They want you to see them. But as they start to feel safe, that's when you might start to see those behaviors, because it's as they feel safe that they feel like they can be themselves. And that's when those trauma behaviors are going to start to appear. And that can be from bedwetting, night terrors, those things they don't feel like they can control, to throwing their toys, having temper tantrums. It really depends on the age of the child. Kind of, can they communicate verbally or can they not? But all of them don't know how to express their emotion in a healthy way. And so that's a lot of what we're working with children to. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did.
Or not. I'm sorry.
I think there's something really powerful in that. So the kid comes into the home. They may be on good behavior for a season, much like a young couple who starts dating, right? Like they're putting their best foot forward.
Right.
And then time goes by, and the real person comes out, right?
Right.
With their good and the bad and the ugly.
Right.
And if we react poorly to that, we are telling them that the real you is not good.
Right. We're
Right?
reinforcing what they already think about themselves.
We're reinforcing it. So in that moment, the importance of responding, the importance of being Jesus and loving, even though there's madness in front of you, is maybe the most important thing that you can do.
Absolutely.
Right?
And it's easy to say and very hard to do, because in those moments you're stressed as a foster parent.
Right.
And so one of the things we really work with foster parents is you have to make sure you control your own emotions so that you can be in that place to provide that voice of reason when they don't know, because a lot of times our children don't have a voice.
So I think that my next question, I think there's a very obvious kind of comparison to addiction recovery and relapse prevention. So one of the main tenets of relapse preventions is educating yourself on, quote, triggers, end quote. So the fancy word for that is environmental and personal cues.
Right.
Things that cue you to think about or react to your addiction. How are triggers, as it relates to childhood traumas, similar or different than what I just described for addiction recovery?
Well, I think it's very similar in that. And so one of the things we work with foster parents, because trauma does have triggers, and when they're triggered, there's behaviors that tend to follow that trigger, be that a quiet isolation trigger or an explosive trigger. But the key for our foster parents is they need to also know their own triggers. So a foster parent who was raised where respect was a huge thing in their home, and they expect this foster child to give respect, that's a trigger for that foster parent. And so if they know that ahead of time, then hopefully they're going to, instead of react to the foster child, they're going to respond. So there's triggers in the sense as our foster parents need to know what their own kind of triggers are, so that they can
Know thyself.
Know thyself, exactly. So that they will, I'm trying to think of the best word, but basically respond in a better way. So it might be that they need to walk out of the room for a minute, and come back in. But as far as triggers for our foster children, they come in a wide variety of ways.
Depending on their trauma.
It's
completely personalized to the human being and what they've experienced.
And
so can you give some examples of it?
Sure. So I remember working with a foster parent who this child came into care. And so for your listeners to know, a lot of times we don't know the history of this child when they first come into a foster home. We're not given the full story. And maybe DSS doesn't know the full story. We may only know they were brought into care due to neglect. We don't know what that neglect was. So that was the case of this foster child, a 5-year-old, who had limited language skills. So she thought, children love pizza. We're going to have pizza for dinner. And this was on the second night. The first night got there just in time to go to bed. This child saw that pizza on the table and melted down. Full tantrum. But he couldn't verbalize why he was tantruming. They just knew, oh my goodness, what's going on? A couple days later, they had pizza again. This child melted down. And they're like, they finally cued in, well, maybe it has something to do with the pizza. They've discovered that this child, the neglect was he would be left alone with his siblings in an apartment for days. And right before Mom left, she would leave 3 or 4 pizzas on the table. And so that's how they knew Mom wasn't coming back for a couple of days.
Wow.
So when this child saw that pizza, he thought these foster parents were going to leave him in this house again all by himself. So that pizza was a trigger for that child. And so what Mom learned was she didn't want her own children not to have pizza. She would provide an option for him, and she would tell him ahead of time, because that's what these kids need to know. Transitions are really hard for foster children. Tomorrow night we're going to have pizza for dinner, but I'll also make you chicken nuggets or mac and cheese. Which would you want? And so that's what they did until probably a year after being in that home. Just one night without, they had pizza. He had his chicken nuggets. He reached over and ate a piece of pizza. Nobody said anything. They all just didn't make a big deal out of it. But it was like that was the sign that he was starting to kind of heal from that. Yeah. That trigger was no longer his trigger anymore.
So that doesn't mean the trauma was fixed. I want to make sure that's clear.
Absolutely.
Right? So his relationship to pizza changed.
Right.
But probably for the rest of his life, when he sees a pizza, he may think about that.
He'll remember, right.
Yeah. Maybe not every time.
He'll have a different response probably most of the time. But if he's caught off guard, he still may have a trauma response to that even as an adult.
Yep. Wow. What does trauma look like in teens?
Again, all teens are going to respond differently. But a lot of the times what you're going to see with our teenagers, they do have language skills. And some of them are going to use those language skills to tell you exactly how they feel about you. Mm-hmm. And they're going to push away any authority at all. So you're going to see a lot of authority issues at school, at home, in the community. That's when you also start to see those addictive behaviors start to creep in. A lot of our girls, you'll see, are cutters because maybe they've numbed themselves to the pain and they want to feel something. And when they cut their skin, they feel pain. And so you may see that. Some kids isolate to the point where they have no relationships whatsoever. Mm-hmm. You also, and you can see some of this in younger, and unfortunately I think it's getting younger and younger, age-wise, as far as seeing some of these bigger issues. But suicidal thoughts and plans and attempts are one of the bigger issues. Also runaway because they have the capability of, they feel like they've got it all figured out. I can do better on my own. I don't need you to tell me how to live my life.
There's a, I don't know the name of the show. There are these clips on YouTube under the hashtag world's strictest parents. And these out of control teenagers are taken out of their house and they're placed with these extremely strict families. And so I've seen a few of these clips where, the parents are saying, well, while you're in this house, you're going to do these things. Right. And the kids are boycotting it. And to be honest, I thought it was hilarious.
Right.
Like watching these kids react to it. But now that I'm thinking about it, like these kids are probably traumatized.
Probably.
Right? To be behaving so poorly.
Right.
And then you're snatching them out of their house for a television show.
Adding more trauma.
Putting them in this extremely strict environment and saying your behaviors are wrong.
Right.
Meaning you're wrong.
Right.
And this is what you're going to do. It's a terrible idea.
Yeah, it really is a terrible idea.
Right?
I haven't seen this. So.
Yeah. Man. I hope the producers aren't going to hear this and get mad at me. But this sounds like a really traumatizing thing to do to kids.
Well, and I think the key, just you made me think about something, is even with these children who are having these behaviors, they still need boundaries.
Right.
They don't understand boundaries. Sure. So our goal is to try to teach those boundaries. There's still consequences to their behavior. Sure. But it's how we speak to them and the mindset we speak to them. And and that those boundaries and those consequences are in a way that is retraining their brain to understand that. And sometimes that happens quickly, and sometimes that takes years. And sometimes it never takes, unfortunately.
Yeah, in my own life, there are 2 wounds, 2 traumas, and I've received dozens of hours of counseling, and I'm in a really healthy place on those kind of issues.
Right.
I don't think they're ever going away.
No, I don't think yeah.
Right? Like, I don't cry about them when I think about them every time.
Right.
But there are moments that I get triggered.
Right.
That takes me back to a spot, and I don't know that, number one, that it'll ever go away. And number two, at this point, I'm healthy enough to say, I don't know that I want them to ever go all the way away, because they make me who I am.
Right.
Right. Both the trauma and the healing from the trauma make me the man that I am today.
Right.
And so if I completely forgot about them, that's a piece of my identity that's gone. That's a puzzle piece that I'm pretending like is not there.
Right.
So let's switch gears and go to the other side of this thing and work our way towards landing the plane. So as I just said, I've got traumas in my own life. Probably most people have traumas. Certainly some people's experiences are 1,000 times more challenging than mine.
Right.
But I want to acknowledge that as we talk about healing from trauma, that this is information that is not just applicable to foster care children.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Like
yeah.
this extends to all children and all of us adults who were also once children.
Right.
Right? Like
exactly.
It's all part of one big equation. So I guess, what is kind of trauma-informed training? I think you've pointed to some of the trainings for the foster parents, but what is that, and who in foster care should receive it?
So trauma-informed training. So here at Miracle Hill, we use a training called ARC Reflections. And so typically these are, if it's an informed training, that it has been tried and tested and seen positive results. Mm-hmm. So one of the so ARC Reflections is one of those type trainings. It has been through all the trials and technical jargon. Mm-hmm. They've done the research and seen that there's been positive results.
Sure.
And so a lot of the training is for the foster parent. So one of the points I want to make is that trauma-informed training is not for the child.
Right.
Our goal is not to fix this child that comes in our home. Mm-hmm. Our goal is to help parents understand how to work with that child. So often I think one of the misconceptions when a foster parent or anybody goes to a trauma training, it's, I want tools to know how to fix somebody. Well, we can't fix somebody. They have to work through their own therapy and training. So our goal is to give
pause
them.
On that.
Yes.
So it's not our job to fix other people.
Absolutely. Even though that's hard,
right.
It is not our job.
So, and that principle applies to everything Miracle Hill does. It is not our job to fix the people in our shelters or the people in our addiction recovery programs or the foster children or the foster parents. Right. Or the other staff members.
Right.
Our job is to be Jesus to them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so go back to your training.
And so the biggest part of the training is, a big part of that training is to learn how trauma affects the brain. So it's information.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then the next part of that training is to give strategies. Again, like we talked about, knowing yourself, knowing what your own triggers are so that you can minister. As far as Miracle Hill is concerned, we want our foster families to be ministers to these children and know how to communicate and how body language and all of that kind of comes into play with that. And so there are a lot of trauma trainings.
Sure.
The meat of all of them is the same. Not much changes.
Okay.
From trauma training to trauma training. Some are those informed ones that have the research behind
Sure.
them, and that's the ones we want to use. I think the misconception with trauma training, and I've heard this from several foster parents, is they're coming to that training and they want to know, if my child is doing this behavior, then I do this and it will all go away.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, that would be great. The world would be wonderful if we had this if then do that.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's not that easy or that cut and dry. There are definitely techniques and therapies. If your child is bedwetting, we're going to work on these things. But what works for one child may not work for the next.
So then the training serves what purpose? To educate them to help the child to the best of their ability?
Right. So it's training them to understand. So we want them to reframe the question, not what's wrong with this child, but what happened to this child. So that's part of the training. And the other training is to learn how to respond instead of react to the behaviors they see in their home. So that's the biggest part of what we're doing, is we want you to learn how to respond to, because if your own trigger is respect, and you have a 12-year-old who rolls their eyes at you that's seen as very disrespectful, you're probably going to react to that behavior instead of respond to that behavior.
So do all of Miracle Hill's care coordinators, they've all had this training?
They have.
And are all foster parents required or offered this training?
So they're all offered the training. So all of Miracle Hill, and they're highly recommended.
Okay.
To take, if not ARC Reflections, which is ours, some type of trauma training. It is not a state requirement. So Miracle Hill tries to only, the required trainings are the ones that the state requires, that foster parents. I wish that trauma was one of the state required. I think it needs to be one of the state required. But we here at Miracle Hill highly recommend. So our care coordinators who are trained in this are reminding our foster parents, you need trauma training. Make sure you're taking a trauma training.
So this is a nuts and bolts question, and I'll make it very quick. So all foster parents have to do X number of hours of training. Are each one of the X number of hours dictated, or is it like this percentage is dictated and the rest of it's electives?
So, yes. So, very few are dictated.
Okay.
So, there's a standard 5 or 6 trainings that you have to have at least once.
Okay.
So, not every 2 years.
Sure.
So, a licensing cycle is every 2 years. You have to have 30 hours of continuing education hours in that 2-year cycle. That first 2-year cycle, there's some certain classes they ask you to take.
Right.
That are the mandated classes. The only other mandated classes after that, there's psychotropic meds training you do every year. Care coordinators, foster parents, everybody in the program has to do that. CPR and first aid,
Sure.
you have every 2 years.
Yep.
Again, everybody's mandated for that. The rest of your training hours are really up to you as the foster parent.
And so the care coordinator is going to help them design, a package that would best serve them of training
Yes.
courses, but this would be one that you would say that everybody would benefit from.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so Miracle Hill, we do give out to our families topics. And we say, we would like for you in this 2 years to pick a training from each topic so that they're not doing 20 hours in, relationship building and they have a 2-year-old, or they're not doing 20 hours in, I can't remember all the topics,
Right.
development.
Yeah.
Maybe they have a teenager and they need to take, or at this stage in their foster care, they need to focus in on that. Or if we've had issues in that foster home, then we're going to steer them. We really think you need a training in this. Again, not mandate it, but we're highly recommending and kind of steering them in that direction.
Okay, so there are some listeners that are like their finger is close to the turn off button. And here's the reason why. Because we're talking about therapies and trainings and the dreaded word psychology.
Right.
So I want to be clear that at Miracle Hill, we're not training or pushing anything that is in opposition to the Bible, right?
Absolutely.
We want to maintain the legitimacy and the superiority of Scripture overall.
Right.
That being said, I believe you would say that what we're talking about here is reflective of biblical principles. Are there biblical principles that you can think of that when you think about trauma therapy or trauma-informed care that you're like, oh man, that's like this biblical principle in action?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, there really are a lot. I think when I look back at my training, so like I said, there's a lot of therapies out there.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are built on biblical principle.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know it, or they might not realize it. But I think about there's a training called TFCBT, which is trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, which in and of itself, not biblical.
Mm-hmm.
But the main component of helping children deal with trauma, and even adults, is they remind them of the trauma. What were you thinking about that trauma? And then, okay, so now take that thought and let's reframe it, which is biblical, take every thought captive. But one of the concerns with psychology sometimes is it's taking it within yourself and dealing, how would you reframe that? Or biblically, how would God reframe that in our eyes?
What does the Bible say?
What does the Bible
about this as
right.
it relates to who you are in Christ, hopefully?
Right. Absolutely. So, one of the concerns I think with a lot of our foster families, to get these trauma-focused therapies, you have to be a licensed state counselor or a state licensed therapist. And there are I have wonderful friends who are believers who are licensed state counselors, but they can't use specifically biblical principle in their training. But God ordained all of his word, and a lot of what they're using, you can look back into Scripture. I took a class. I have this sheet with me I wanted to bring on purpose. So one of the things they talk about in therapy is the circle of security. And so one things you want to get someone who's experienced trauma is to understand they have somebody secure to go back to when that happens. And what he used in this was Philippians 4, 6, and 7. In that circle of security, the Lord is near. Like when you need to seek somebody out, we need to be seeking the Lord as that safety of security. And so that whole premise can be seen in Scripture, although maybe not all therapists use it that way. A foster family certainly can when that child comes home from therapy and is talking about maybe something that they learned in therapy. That foster family can be reinforcing those skills, but in a biblical way, and not just in that therapeutic kind of seek within yourself kind of way.
So you said that it's the foster parent, the care coordinator, they go through this training not to fix the trauma.
Right.
Oftentimes the child or the human being will wind up in, quote, therapy, end quote, hopefully trauma-informed therapy.
Right.
If the parent's not supposed to fix the trauma, what is the goal of trauma-informed therapy?
The goal of the therapy is for them to learn how to, so one of the biggest issues with trauma is children don't know how to name their emotions. So when you ask a child, what's wrong? And they may say, I'm sad. When really, well, I said that wrong. They may say, I'm just tired. When really they're sad. But they don't know how to tell you they're sad. They just know, I'm tired. I'm just going to sit here. Or they may say, I'm mad. And really they're hungry because they hadn't had anything to eat for a couple of days and they're angry. They don't know how to tell you they're hungry. They just know how to tell you they're mad. And so they're putting words to how they feel. So a lot of the therapy that they're getting is to learn how to share emotions appropriately. So not through tantrums and, but they're also learning how to name that emotion because they didn't have a parent that modeled that for them. And so a lot of a healthy attachment is a parent comes in the room, a baby is crying, they look down and smile, and it's all going to be okay. So they learn that when that parent comes to get them when they're sad, they're modeling their behavior. A lot of our kids in foster care, you can smile at them and they still see terror. They don't understand what that emotion looks like. And so what therapy is doing is it's helping them to put words to these feelings that they're going through. So that's the biggest part of therapy is helping them learn healthy attachments and then helping them to put words to these feelings and emotions and then be able to put healthy behaviors with that. And so but I think the biggest point I want to make to that is that as children are in therapy, they need to be in a safe, secure, loving home because huge emotions are going to come out of. So as they start to work through emotions, they don't like it. That's hard work. That's hard work for an adult to sit in therapy and work through their emotions. Can you imagine a child who has no idea what all this means? So they need to be in a place that when they do have these big behaviors start to come up, because they're in therapy, this family is still going to love them through that.
And they're educated.
Right. And they're educated to know how to love them through that.
Okay, so we're gone real long, so I'm gonna ask
sorry.
3 more questions, and then we're gonna land the plane for real. So this one's not on the page in front of you. So there are probably some people that are listening to this who might feel the call to foster care, but they're hearing you and I talk, and they're like, "Man, I ain't doing that."
Right.
Or they're thinking, "I don't want this foster child's traumas to traumatize my children."
Right.
What do you say to them?
I say those are great questions
Yep.
that they need to process, and they need to seek the Lord's guidance, because if the Lord's calling them to foster care, He's going to protect them through that process. But to be as informed as they can. I mean, go take a trauma training class and really we've only talked about a little bit of what's involved in that. And I advise all foster family, I'd rather you have that trauma training before that first child comes into your home and you start to see those behaviors. So sometimes for us, they're getting that trauma training while that child is in their home. So go have that education prior to. But at the same time, listen to the Lord's kind of call and be obedient. I mean, it's not easy. I mean, all of the steps we make, I think, as believers, when God asks us to be obedient, most of them are not easy steps to make. But if He's called us to do it, then we're supposed to do it.
Okay, I'm going to ask you 4 questions at once.
Oh, no.
And this is the last one, though. Okay? So this is about resources.
Okay.
So there's a foster parent listening to this, and they're identifying that the foster child that they have in their care needs trauma-informed therapy, and they need trauma training. There is a parent of just regular children that is identifying it in their own household, and then probably the majority are adults that this may be uncovering traumas in their own life, and they don't know what to do with that. Right. So where would you send the foster parent? Where would you send the parent? And where would you send the adult to identify, get training, and or get therapy as it relates to this?
Wow. So there are a lot of different resources.
Okay.
The South Carolina Foster Parents Association. So there's a website that really anybody can go to. You don't have to be a foster parent to go to that website. And they list a long list of trainings in everything from parenting to trauma training, and they also do the ARC reflections.
Is that for just for foster
No,
parents?
that is for even if you're considering to be a foster parent, even if you're a parent and you want more information, you can go on that website to get that information.
Listing lots of things in the
Yes.
show notes. We'll get that one in
Yes.
the show notes too.
And they'll link you to those trainings.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is, and I'll link this, but there is a website, the National, and I'm going to get the acronym wrong, so we'll just put it in the show notes. But it's the Child Abuse, the National Child Abuse something. Again, they have free trainings, and then there are trainings that you pay for, all along the lines of parenting and stress and trauma-informed care. That is great for all. It's even a great resource for adults who feel like maybe they've had traumatic childhood. Again, you can go to the CDC and take that ACEs test just to see where you score on that.
Sure.
And then they also on there tell you if your score is this, here's some resources for that. One of the biggest things, I mean, there are a lot of trauma therapy counselors, and well, not a lot, unfortunately, not as many as we need. Bloom Therapy is a great therapeutic resource in Greenville County.
For children or
adults and families.
Okay.
So they actually do a training that brings the whole family together to do that training, which is so helpful because if a child is getting therapy, but yet they're going to a home where they're still experiencing, then it's almost a mute point. So they do a little bit of everything.
Sure.
But one of the best resources we have, in my opinion, is our churches. So there's so many churches in the upstate that have counseling ministries, who have pastors and staff members who have those resources. So I may not know all the resources, but if you were to reach out to your local church, if you're not in church, I know that I'll shout out my own Rocky Creek Baptist Church. We have a mental health ministry.
Shout out Becky.
I know. Shout out to Becky Kirby. That you can contact them. You do not have to be a church member to access those resources. And there's biblical counseling. And if you need more than that, then they have the resources. They have a long list of resources to kind of plug you in somewhere else.
Diane, this has been amazing. Thank you for coming on. I think this is one of the more educational things that we've done. It was very informative. Also compelling, right?
Yeah.
That there are a lot of hurt children and adults out there that need help. Would you honor us and close us in prayer, praying for those who, are identified or might need help in this arena?
Sure.
Great.
Father, I want to thank you so much for just an opportunity to spend some time talking about our children and those that are the most vulnerable in our society. And Lord, right now, I ask you to protect them, their little hearts, their minds, their bodies, those that are still possibly in harmful situations, that you would put eyes and ears to see so that they can be removed from those situations. But Lord, I also ask that you be with those homes that might take in these children, that, Lord, they take the time necessary to educate themselves, but most of all, that they're spending time now in your word and in meditation so that you can give them the strength they need. Lord, be with our current foster families as they are loving on children that, Lord, just to be honest, they're not always easy to love. But, Lord, through you, we can do give them the most love they need. But, Lord, we need to lean on you for that. Lord, there are so many adults and children who've experienced trauma. Some of them may not even realize it. They're walking around in pain. They may be in our streets, they're homeless, and they just need somebody to love them. Not because of what they've done, but because of who they are and who you've made them to be. Lord, we thank you for those who have stepped up in this ministry to be mentors and to step out and to love people, because that's our mandate from you. And we ask that you continue to give those in our society that mindset, that we would lean on you. But most of all, Lord, right now there's somebody listening that maybe you've touched their heart to be a foster parent or to be a mentor, or maybe even just to help a foster parent. Lord, that you would give them the courage to continue to walk that through, that they will do the research, but most of all, that they'll spend time in you and be obedient to the call that you've called them to. We thank you for this opportunity, and Lord, we hope that through the rest of this day, that we're spending time in you and learning more about what you would call us, what you've called us to. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you again, Diane.
You're welcome.
Say goodbye, everybody.
Bye.